Wow. Well, what a fun entrance there. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person, and right now I'm in Miami. As you can see, this very tropical kind of vibe that I've got going on here, and I'm sure the weather's probably quite different there. But I've got some very interesting things to talk about today. And I really want to thank the organizers for allowing this to happen and making it happen as well. And first of all, the thing that I probably spend most of my time doing these days is working in mathematics. And the reason why I went deep into mathematics is not because, and I don't study the math necessarily that's already there, although I do a lot of that too. The math that I do is I bring new mathematics in. So I've written several books. You can read my books on Amazon. One of them is called Philomath. And I found that for about 15 years now, when I get into a place of, very stable or higher consciousness, particularly with alpha brainwaves, I'm able to pull in new mathematics. And, for example, one of the things that that came in this week was a new formulation or new format for what I would call a universal construction box for all geometric forms. And we know probably Metatron's cube, but most people don't know that Metatron's cube doesn't actually work in drawing anything other than a cube and a tetrahedron and an octahedron. And even those cannot be done in hyperperspectives. So what I was able to discover was a new format for a universal construction box. This is only about 3 days ago. And you can find out about it if you go on my Instagram page. But basically, it's a doubling of the cube of Metatron. So you have it offset, and it creates a 12-point perspective that allows for omnidirectional projection. Now, I think this is going to become something important, very likely in AI. It's going to become something very important in virtual reality, even, because it gives you a perspective that's way more hyper perspective than what you see with all the other kind of construction formats for what we call linear perspective geometry. And it brings to life in new ways these from cubes to dodecahedra. And now the dodecahedron can be drawn perfectly with golden ratio proportions without any measurements whatsoever. And additionally, and if you don't know the cube of Metatron, it's this, right? You can see this necklace that I'm wearing right here. Imagine another one that basically overlays on top of it. And what's interesting about this is it now allows us to draw even all of the Archimedean solids and the Catalan solids, and to be able to do it again with no measurements. Now, this is a principle that comes from ancient Greece. And most people probably don't know this story as well, which is in ancient Greece at the time of Plato, there was a plague in the land. So around the 4th, 5th century BC, they had a major plague that was, all around the land, and thousands of people were dying. It was sort of their version of a pandemic. And so they decided to go to the oracle at Delphi to ask the oracle of Delphi on this island that's not far from Mykonos, what they can do to get rid of this plague and to save the people that had been dying from this plague. And basically the oracle of Delphi said, you must double the cube to the sun god Apollo. And once you double the cube, and you have to use compass and straight edge construction, which means no measurements whatsoever, because God, when he created the universe, didn't have a ruler, and neither should you. The no measurement part becomes telling us that the universe is a universe about ratio. So we need to experience certain things in order to understand what other things are like. Therefore, we come into a world where we can learn through opposites. So for example, if I'm here to learn pleasure, then unfortunately, in order for me to have context for that pleasure, I have to also experience what pain is. In fact, the extent to which I understand what pain is going to define how much I understand what pleasure can be. And so this becomes this duality existence that we have. And so the Oracle of Delphi went on to say that once you double the cube successfully, then that will mark the end of death, the end of aging, and the end of sickness. Now, this was very interesting to me because I've always been following this. And so what happened was it set off all these Greek mathematicians to a frenzy because they were trying to figure out how to double the cube of Delos, which was to the sun god Apollo, which is also known as Ra in the Egyptian pantheon. how do they double this cube? So that means they have to increase the side by 1.26, which became fundamental in doubling octaves in music, because the major third, which is 5/4 in Pythagorean tuning, cannot actually double an octave, because when you take that to the third power, it only gets, from 10 to 20 hertz rather than 10 to 19.5 hertz rather than 10 to 20 hertz, which is required to double the octave successfully. And you have to have this marriage of the 3/2, which is the perfect fifth in music, and also this cubed root of 2, which is another way of looking at 3/2, and that's 1.26. And so they were trying to find this way to draw this with compass and straight edge construction, and they could not solve it. They could not figure it out. So this became one of the ancient 3 problems. I wrote about it in my book. The solving of how do you double a cube without any measurements, and it couldn't be done. And so then the plague just kind of went on and on. It didn't just end abruptly or anything, because they never solved this problem. Well, what I just realized now is that there was a metaphor related to this. And the metaphor, I believe that probably somebody knew this, and possibly this was one of those occulted knowledge things. And so now we do have an answer for it, but the doubling of the cube was not related to the actual volume necessarily of the cube. It was the understanding that the cube had to be doubled in order to be able to perceive all the forms in the universe. So all forms, the Platonic solids, Archimedeans, and as well as the Catalan solids. And now anybody can use this simple technique to draw any one of these forms successfully. And I'm very excited that this happened. But the way that this all comes in for me is by getting into a meditative state. And then it's a process, I would say, of remembrance. Now, I want you to remember that for a moment, because I believe fundamentally we're here, and I tend to believe in, a lot of the simulation theory stuff that was put forward by Nick Bostrom. I believe that this world in some way, shape, or form is a conscious simulation. And in fact, we live in a U-inverse where we experience the opposites in order to learn the things that we're here to learn. So if I'm here to learn unconditional love, then unfortunately, I'm going to experience the opposite in its extreme form of unconditional love as the pattern in my life over and over and over again. And unfortunately, that's betrayal. And so until we start realizing that it's a game and that it has a purpose, we can find ourselves in a hellish environment and not understand how to play the game. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to basically put forward to you how your consciousness is already creating your reality. And not only is your consciousness already creating your reality, you may not even be aware at all that literally all the things that you are here to learn show up in the world around you as opposites, and they become triggers. So every trigger that you experience becomes an opportunity to learn what you're here to learn in disguise. Now, why is this? Because in this world, we attract everything that we judge until we no longer judge everything we attracted. I'm going to repeat that. We attract everything we judge until we no longer judge what we attract. So that means that if you're here and you start experiencing the same experiences over and over and over again, a lack of success, or maybe right before your big success, you somehow sabotage yourself. Have any of us felt that way before? I certainly have. You start realizing that your biggest competitor or your biggest enemy sometimes is who you are within yourself and the negative self-narrative that you might give yourself. Because you're here to remember all these things along your own journey of remembrance, your own journey. And that becomes, when you find out and remember who you are, that becomes the true elixir of life. So mathematics becomes the abstract form of consciousness. And you could say that geometry is the coherence of that consciousness. Now let's take that a step further. If we look at the human brain has the right side and the left side, the hemispheres of the brain. The goal that we have here through that remembrance is to achieve perfect hemisynchronization. That means someone, in an ancient sense as well, that's able to tap in and both think and feel at the same time. Now, one of the important things to note is that men seem to be born with smaller corpus callosums than women. We may have a larger by volume brain size because we're physically larger, but the tissue that connects the left and right brain is actually larger in a woman than it is in a man. Because this is why women are able to think and feel at the same time, whereas men very often can either think or feel. They're not able to think and feel at the same time. Of course, this is not true for everybody, but it's certainly true when we look across the sort of data sets and the studies that have basically been done on this. So when we look at this brain hemisynchronization, you could say that they have different seats of your brain. So on my right temporal lobe, right here, right above my ear, is where I would say is the seat of my processing of music, for example. So what's the abstract form of music? And what gets mirrored on the other side is mathematical ratio and mathematics. So this is where musical interval comes from. So all of music is actually, in its abstract form, mathematics. That's why we have the musical scale, which is based on ratios, 5/4 for the major third, as I've already said, or the cube root of 2. And then we have the 4/3 for the perfect fourth, and 3/2 for the perfect fifth. Now, what I'd found is that all of these notes can be found in the proportional ratios of the Great Pyramid and the two pyramids next to it on the Giza Plateau. That's one of the things that my research basically came up with. I looked at the slope angles of each of the pyramids, and I realized that Menkaure Pyramid was 5/4. The height is 5 versus 4, 1/2 its base. And that determines the 51.34 degree angle. And then the second pyramid, Khafre Pyramid, is 4/3. And that's 1.33333. And that determines the perfect fourth. And that is the ratio of the perfect fourth. And then the perfect fifth is 3/2. Simply take the full base of Khafre Pyramid, 6 over the 4 of its height, and then you've got 3/2 as its reduction, reduced form. And that gives us the perfect fifth. So wait, 5/4, 4/3, 3/2, does that mean the Great Pyramid is 2/1? Well, in a way, yes, it does, because the Great Pyramid turned out to be 2/1 pi as its height over its base. So we literally had 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This was a pattern, and it makes a musical chord, and it's a major chord. Da, 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 da. That's literally the music of the Giza Plateau. And this is something that's irrefutable. It's mathematically proven. And it's built right into the ratios, and the proportions are perfectly within that. So this opens up for us this notion that, hold on a second, if music is in my right brain, and the left side of my brain is going to be the abstract form of music, where's geometry? It's in the center of my brain. It's the seat where language is also processed. And I learned several languages in my lifetime, and so I somehow became good at perceiving geometric form as a result. You could say that geometry is the music we experience with our eyes. You could also say that music is the geometry we're experiencing with our ears. And the abstract form of all of that is the mathematics, the numbers that underlie it. And this is basically being mirrored across my brain through mirror symmetry and mirror neurons. It's basically a process of seeing ourselves in the mirror. And the process of remembrance is a process of seeing yourself within a mirror as well. So this leads us to harmonic proportion. I was invited in June to Tirana, Albania, to speak at a large architectural conference. It was the top 250 architects in the world. And they asked me to come there and speak on harmonic geometry and its use within architecture. So when I said that geometry is the music that we're experiencing with our eyes, maybe the best way to experience that geometry is through architecture. When we walk into a room, its proportions, it might be golden ratio, it might be 5/4. It's entraining certain emotional states. And so the cognitive neuroscientist, a good friend of mine, Donald Hoffman, who's been published on the mathematical mapping of the human consciousness many times in Nature and other major journals, he asked me, he came to my office for a day, and he basically said, hey, Robert, can you give me a mathematical equation? Can you figure out a way to remember the mathematical equation for emotional states? And I was like, Well, I haven't had my coffee yet. I mean, that's kind of a big question, right? How in the heck are you going to come up with a mathematical equation for emotional states? And the next day, I was flying to Salzburg, Austria, music capital of the world, or at least arguably one of. And I was watching a film, and during the film, I noticed that the music of the film was basically entraining me. It was a movie called Shakespeare in Love. And it was entraining me to feel love, romantic love, during the scenes, because there was this love affair going on between, it was Ralph, not Ralph Fiennes, Joseph Fiennes and Gwyneth Paltrow. So I'm watching this film and I'm thinking, wow, it's interesting because the music is all coming up as major thirds. Da, da. It's all like da, da. It's very beautiful music. And then as we approach the end of the film, and they're going to have to break up, and the relationship is going to end because she's having to be shipped off to the Americas, which then became the basis of the film, the 12th Night, right? I think that was the one. It was The Tempest, excuse me, The Tempest. So basically what happens is the music starts shifting. It's no longer da-da, it's da-da, da-da, which is the minor sixth. So it's the same two notes, just one is to a higher octave, and it's in reverse ordering. And this is changing the feeling from romantic love to heartbreak. So I start realizing, wait a minute, this is what we're using in filmology all the time. We're entraining people to certain emotional states by use of mathematical ratio. And I started looking up to see if there was research on this. And sure enough, they weren't looking at it from a mathematical ratio perspective, but they were saying, here's how you write music. The subject of the research was, here's how you write music in a way that's going to entrain certain emotional states. And the emotional states were well defined. So the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth were loyalty and stability, respectively, right? The major third is romantic love or divine love and joy. The minor sixth, its opposite, its mirrored opposite, is heartbreak. The major second is victory, winning, success. And the minor seventh, its opposite, becomes loss, failure. So could it be that we literally have the mathematical equations of all of our emotional states somehow embedded within musical interval? And that in its form is already mathematical ratio? And that's what I told him. I came back from the trip. I said, I think that's what it is. You asked me the question, what are the emotional states and what are the equations related to those emotional states? So I gave him all the musical intervals and the peer-reviewed research that backed it up, that was already there. When we understand this, we start realizing, wait a minute, what exactly are we living in? If it's all mathematical like this, who's writing all this source code? Who's the architect? Earlier this year, I made a new AI, and I didn't intend to. It wasn't an intentional thing. I've written, several books now in new mathematics. All my books are probably 80% entirely novel math. And one of the challenges that we have in society today is large language models, and how do we expand large language models? And pretty much you're going to find that it's pretty damn impossible to expand a large language model unless you find new mathematics. Higher dimensional math is going to become the foundational basis, and our awareness of that math is going to become the foundational basis, in my personal view and opinion, of programming code in the future. Computers are going to be making programming code. They already are. I mean, I can now pull up a website with one prompt. I mean, that's nuts. It's going to force everybody to shift. One of the things that's happening right now are people that were working in astrology and in numerology, their businesses are way down. Why are they down? Because people are using AI to perform those same types of functions or getting the right answers, even though AI is very often not totally accurate because it doesn't use the right kind of mathematics. AI uses floating point math. So its precision is off. And that's why numerology is off on AI. And that's why it's off on astrology as well. So this needs to be fixed. We have to move away from floating point mathematics, in my opinion. But what this is basically saying is that AI is already disrupting so many industries. And you could look at this two ways. You could say, oh my gosh, this is going to be horrible. I'm going to be out of a job. Or you could say, I'm going to get on the front end of this and I'm going to adapt quickly, because this is what natural selection allows us to do and sometimes forces us to do. So AI is now going to be looking for expansion to large language. And geometry becomes large language. Now, one of the things I did when I learned languages, as I learned 8, is I decided not to learn language. My second language was the Korean language. So I lived in South Korea when I was 19 years old. So, not exactly the easiest language in the world to learn. And as I started learning the language, I started creating my own technique of learning the language. So of course I took books and I studied and everything else. But after a while, I realized that what was it that was actually going to make me successful in learning the language? And I used this method, and I realized that the game was how to perceive and learn at least 2,000 verbs. So one of the things I noticed in language is that people will learn the English language, because pretty much every country, if they're not native speakers of English, they have to learn English. So what they do is they end up studying a lot of nouns, and very often they may learn a ton of nouns, at least this was the case in South Korea, and yet they still can't really speak well. And because they don't really understand the verb conjugation so easy. And in Korean language, it's kind of backwards to the English language, right? It's an agglutinative language. It's similar to Finnish. Finnish is also not easy to learn. And given its proximity to you, you might have some similarities in your languages as well, in the natives that are basically in Latvia, in the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania. And so I looked at it and said, well, how many verbs do I know? I'm going to learn how to conjugate the verbs. And if I get stuck with the noun and I can't remember the noun, I'll at least know how to conjugate it if I use an English pronunciation for it in their sort of accents. So in Japan, you could say computer, right? And it works. And so I started to learn language this way. Within 6 months, I was completely fluent in Korean. And I was actually the translator for the whole large group that I was there with. I would, translate for the dignitaries and everything. But I realized, okay, after I got home, I decided to learn Japanese, and I learned Japanese the same way. And you can learn languages based on the first words that you hear the most often. So that's the other thing I did. I would listen for the words I heard the most often, because I also wanted to learn the culture of the place. So when I went to Japan, the word I kept hearing over and over and over again was dame, dame desu. Dame means it's not allowed. And then when I flew to Germany and I landed at the airport in Frankfurt, the first thing I see in Frankfurt is a hangar that on the side says verboten. Verboten. I mean, who in what other country would have a hangar when you land in a place that says forbidden on the side of it in giant letters? Well, Germans would. And the next word I learned was genau, because they kept saying it over and over and over again. I lived in Germany for 3 years. So I understood then that the German culture was a culture that values exactitude and what's allowed and what's not allowed. That tells you a lot about cultures. I go to France and I'm driving around the Arc de Triomphe and there's no lines on the road. It's a total mess. And this complete mess of nobody having lines somehow works. And so I asked someone, I said, how is this possible? And I noticed that they have the way to say the word of course, or the words of course, its meaning, like 5 different ways. Tout à fait, mais oui, pas bien sûr. This is a culture that values, tout est possible, everything is possible. And that then leads to so many other aspects of society, entrepreneurship, everything else. I went to Israel, and the first words I learned when I learned Hebrew were pikeach. Pikeach means clever. Certain languages don't even have words like of course. German doesn't even have a word for of course. It's only naturally. This is telling you a lot about the culture. So I started using this method and I realized, okay, about 15 years ago, I started thinking, well, what if I looked at mathematics as a language? If I need 2,000 verbs to speak the language of the universe, what would be those verbs? So I started thinking, okay, how could I make a gerund? A gerund would be to do something, right? You could say text, but then texting turns it into a verb. The ing turns it into a verb. Text is just a noun. So I started going deeper into this and I realized, wait a minute, what would be the equivalent of an unfinished action in mathematics? So in other words, how could I say a diameter is circling, right? Or circling a diameter, and that becomes the verb, circling. And of course, that would be pi. And pi has a transcendental irrational tail that never stops. So then I started realizing, oh, this is like in French where we say, je suis en train de quelque chose. I'm in the middle of doing something. I'm in the process. I'm in the train of doing something. This creates the gerund. And so I started thinking, whoa, wait a minute. Does this mean that the verbs are the mathematical constants? The transcendental irrational, like pi, golden ratio phi, Euler. And then I started realizing, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Where pi is to circles, Euler is to squares. So this made me realize something like, my goodness, so this language has 2,000 verbs, but how many mathematical constants do we know that have this kind of property that are not just square roots of numbers? And the mathematical constants that we actually know in physics and math is only about 50. 50. So we're trying to speak the universe's language with only 50 verbs. In fact, I started to realize maybe we could assess the level of sophistication of society or a culture, or maybe even a planet, based on its understanding of the number of verbs of the universal language it actually gets. And you could extend that to all the geometric forms that it knows. Okay, with the Johnson solids, the Catalans, the Archimedean, the Platonic solids, we know about 238 geometries or something like that, like 240 in total. But that's not 2,000 either. So we could say that numbers become the words in this language of the universe. Numbers become the words. And in many languages for many years, in Greece, for example, there were no numbers. It wasn't until much later on that we believed that we invented numbers and that those numbers were invented in the Middle East, right? That it became a process. This was Arabian. And we came up with the process of zero as well, this understanding of zero. But we start understanding, though, that actually maybe we're only remembering everything and we're not actually inventing anything. This is all a function of consciousness, that we're living almost as if in a film that's already made and we're watching it play backwards and somehow we believe that's playing forward. So I started thinking this through and saying, okay, so if numbers are the words in this mathematical language of the universe, and the verbs are the mathematical constants like pi, phi, and Euler, and the Feigenbaum constant, and all these different mathematical constants that we conceive of, the fine structure constant, alpha, then we could possibly think, what would be the sentences? And I realized the sentences are formed from overlapping circles and lines that are formed from those intersecting circles. Imagine two pebbles you drop in a still pond. They form ripples. Those ripples intersect, and out of that is coming the entire number system with all the mathematical constants. So I wrote a paper called The Wave Theory of Number and the Wave Theory of Constants. And I realized that all of this was in a periodic pattern that repeats every 24, that there's a base 24-ness inside of our numbering system. And this is what allowed me to discover the prime number pattern for prediction. Because I started realizing that when you get past the number 5, right, so 5 and beyond, every prime number squared becomes a multiple of 24 plus 1, without exception. Every prime number squared past 5 becomes a multiple of 24 plus 1. So 25 is 5 squared, right? So 5 squared is 24 plus 1. So 7 squared is the next prime, is 49. That's 2 times 24 plus 1. 11 squared is 121. That's 5 times 24 plus 1. So you start to see how this thing starts to basically accumulate, right, over and over and over again as multiples of 24 plus 1. 7 times 7, right? Or rather, excuse me, 13 times 13 is the next 169. That's 7 times 24 plus 1. So we start to understand that there's a pattern in what we thought was entropic. And we could then derive then as a comparison back to ourselves. Maybe what I know is only my level of perception and my conscious awareness. Maybe it's limited by the language that I understand of this universe. So if words are numbers and the mathematical constants become the verbs of this language, what's creating the syntax of the sentences, overlapping circles, and their intersecting geometric forms that are created from those circles create the sentences and paragraphs of this language. And then overlay that with dimension, x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, motion along that z-axis and the other 2 axes. And then the 5th dimension becomes one of spin, rotational spin. So this allows this omnidirectionality. You're moving this way, this way, this way, and then all around this. And then the spin within that motion set becomes the 5th dimension. And this is what led me to starting to challenge the notion of, is there a real value for the square root of -1? The square root of -1 is supposed to be an abstract form. There's no way to come up with a value for the square root of -1, right? Well, actually, I realized, and I wrote a paper on this called Fractal Rooting almost 10 years ago. And I realized that, you know, you think that there's only, for the square root of 4, there's only one number that could perform that function, maybe 2, which would be 2 times 2, and -2 times -2 equals 4. But what if I told you that there's another number that could multiply, that falls within Mandelbrot sets, and an entirely different number that's numerically equivalent, perfectly numerically equivalent, all the way through? And that's 6.32. So 6.32 okay, so 6.32 4555 320 336 759. If I multiply that by its exact same number divided by 10, so that becomes 6.32 4555 320 336 759, and I multiply that by 0.632 4555 320 336 759, it also equals 4 exactly. So there's a new form of square rooting, and it works for all numbers. So you could say, okay, well, the square root of pi, which is one of the mathematical constants that we would use, is 1.772. But actually, can we learn something more by taking the fractal root of pi? The fractal root of pi turns out to be 5.60499. So 5.60499 multiplied by 0.560499 equals 3.14159. And then what could we find as the geometric relationship of that fractal rooting pair? The 5 and 6. wait, isn't that a pentagon and a hexagon that is the foundational basis of all DNA? All DNA are built on nucleotide pairs that are pentagons sitting abutted up against hexagons. So now we could say, oh, well, that makes sense because the 5.6 then is telling us something about DNA itself, the circularity of the spiral. Can we learn something more by using this fractal rooting? Well, I took this a step further and I said, well, are there any numbers that have reciprocal numerical equivalence? So in other words, is there a number that meets the condition like the number 1 whose reciprocal is equal to itself numerically? And the only number that does that is the square root of 10. The square root of 10. So if you take your calculator and turn it sideways and take the square root of 10, it comes out to 3.16227766. And if I take its 1 over x reciprocal, it turns out to be 0.316227766. So if I multiply them together, they come out to 1. Okay, well, what's the big deal, Robert? Well, one thing that we forgot to analyze is that actually you could take this square root of 10 number, and it's the only number that has enough information to square itself through its reciprocal value. But you have to remember something, that in harmonic collapse, which is a known phenomenon in physics, if you take one number and you take its reciprocal, there will be a subtle charge differential on that number because it reverses the spin. The spin becomes reversed. This is why you have entanglement related to electron, which could be x, and 1 over x becomes its positron pair. Now, this is matching up with the Bohr atom model in physics, which was showing lambda and 1 over lambda was determining exactly the frequency of emission and absorption of hydrogen. And it was perfectly correct. This is why it became so compelling in the 1930s and 40s, the Bohr atom model being correct in physics. So I looked at this further and said, well, wait a minute. If the square root of 10 has the ability to square itself through its reciprocal value, don't we have to put a subtle charge difference on it? And isn't it like saying the square root of 10 multiplied by the square root of 10 to the power of -1, which is exactly what a reciprocal equation is? So does that mean it carries a shift in harmonic collapse, a shift in spin, rotation, angular momentum? And it turns out it does. I've now done 28 computer simulations proving that actually what we think of as e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0, the most beautiful equation in all of mathematics, actually does not equal 0 anymore. The e to the I pi plus 1, this Euler's identity equation that mathematicians think is so beautiful, turns out when it equals 0, that is referencing what we would call it's basically a wave function. So e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0 is understood as a rotation, and it's understood as a wave function. But nobody ever thought, well, okay, well, what would be the collapse function of that wave in wave-particle duality? So I substituted I for the square root of 10 to the -1 that is the only number because of its numerical equivalence that can square itself through its reciprocal value and then create the reverse rotational spin. So what does that come out to? E to the I pi plus 1 now no longer equals 0 when we put a real value in for it. What it now equals is 1.370359. Now, some of you might recognize that number. It's the most important number in all of physics. It's called the fine structure constant. The 33rd prime number is 137. In fact, Einstein spoke of that number. So did Wolfgang Pauli. So did Richard Feynman. In fact, Richard Feynman, who worked on the Manhattan Project, said of the number 137, it's as if God wrote that number with his pencil, but we don't know how he pushed his pencil. We don't understand how he derived that as a math equation. And what I'm telling you is that along with the compensator of 42, we take e to the I pi plus 1, and then basically add 42, 1 over 42 times 360 degrees of rotation, and you exactly get the fine structure constant to 8 decimal places of accuracy. And if there's one number that would represent collapse in wave-particle duality, it is the fine structure constant. It is the basis of the Higgs boson. So what does this mean? Does this mean that applying real values to the imaginary number and to the complex plane of number actually can work in quantum physics? Well, I'm not the only one who says that, turns out. I said it first. But there's a research team in Germany that was published in Quantum magazine about a month ago now that basically said, oh, they were able to derive all of the Schrodinger equations of quantum mechanics using real value only. No imaginary number was necessary. Now think about what this might mean when we upload this into AI, because this then becomes a real formatting of awareness of a higher dimension of language to expand the large language model to a 5th dimensional frame. Because right now we have a Cartesian plane. The real value is only in one quadrant. We have X and Y, Z, as I just mentioned, and you've got 1 to infinity in real number, and then you've got 1 to negative infinity, and then 1 to negative infinity, and then 1 to positive infinity. That means you only have one quadrant that is non-abstractified. All of the other quadrants that are used in Cartesian plane, and that's just in 2-dimensional analysis, Euclidean analysis, would be what we call abstract number. So the computer can't really use it to access information. It's more limited. What would happen if we created something that could actually access this larger expansion of the Cartesian plane in 2nd dimension Euclidean and in 3rd and 4th, right? And get into all these other analyses, Minkowski space, etc. And that's exactly what a true expansion of the imaginary number in its real form can do to expand and form a new semantic spine for large language models. At this stage now, the only way that we're going to expand our consciousness is by getting more geometric forms, more awareness of the universal language. The only way we're going to expand large language models is by discovery of novel mathematics. Now, it used to be people like Plato, he came up with all the Platonic solids. Nowadays, we've learned that math is about reductionism. We're no longer learning the language of the universe. I don't even consider myself a mathematician as much as I consider myself just a human being who's learning the language of the universe. So what does that mean? With computers now being able to do all of the ones and zeros in binary coding, the future, in my opinion, will be to upload not only the 5th dimension, but the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and all of it in our awareness right now has been wrong. I can tell you that unequivocally. We have completely not understood the higher dimensional mathematics and how it works. And I believe that humanity has had an understanding of higher dimensional mathematics at different points in time. I believe that transcendental irrational pi was known over the last 200,000 years, probably 9 times, and forgotten. We have the arrogance to believe that where we are in our society right now is the pinnacle of our understanding and awareness. And yet we see ourselves devolving all around us every day with these structures, these strictures on society that impose upon us what's legal and what's illegal, what's truthful and what's not truthful, what's moral and what's amoral. I believe it's time for us to become sovereign and to make these decisions on our own, because God didn't need a ruler and neither do we. By expanding our own conscious awareness and breaking out of these reductionistic patterns and belief that, oh, this is what it is. I mean, I discovered 2 new pyramids on the Giza plateau because I found maps. That scene that you all know with 3 pyramids, very popular, everybody knows it's on all the postcards, actually should have 5 pyramids on it. How did I find this? Well, I found a map maker by the name of Fra Mauro from Venice from 1457. And I happened to be in the museum in Florence called the Galileo Museum. And there's a replica of that map there. It was the map of the known world. And it's interesting what you find for Tartaria in 1457. Tartaria was huge on his map. And this is a very detailed map. He's a Venetian cartographer that was known for being meticulous. And he would actually draw all the buildings out. So I immediately went over to look at where Egypt was. I wanted to see what there was for Giza. And first of all, the name of the Nile River was not the Nile, it was the Gihon River, which is the same name as one of the 4 rivers from the Bible. Isn't that fascinating? So I looked at it further and I found that he had 5 pyramids depicted on the Giza Plateau. So this set me really thinking, why would he have 5 pyramids? Surely, that's not something that you would just make up. And I'm not talking about the satellites, because they were in the wrong proportion for to be the satellites. And they had a certain kind of angular slope. And of course, I was looking at this as well, saying, okay, if the Great Pyramid and Khafre and Menkaure Pyramid are giving us da, 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 then where are the other notes? There should be at least 4 other notes, because the Great Pyramid can actually do with its King's Chamber is 2/1. It allows you, its proportion allows you to have the next octave. And so I realized maybe there's missing 2 pyramids. So I started looking for other cartographers. So I found 2 other cartographers. They didn't know each other. One of them was by the name of Pocock in 1743. And these are all pre the timeline of Napoleon, which gave us a lot of our today understanding of Egypt, because he brought many scholars with him. This is during his conquest of Palestine, and basically ended up in Egypt for a while. And he actually spent the night in the Great Pyramid. And so when I looked at this and these other maps, Pocock had 5 pyramids depicted also in the same spots. And then Norden in 1755, who didn't know Pocock, made a map as well, where there were 4 pyramids, and one of the 2 extra pyramids was in the exact same spot as Pocock's map. So of course, I'm not the kind of person that sits around. I ended up flying to Egypt, and I met with the Ministry of Antiquities, who they know me very well because of my television show where I cover a lot of these topics on it. It's called Code X on Gaia. I am about to shoot my 3rd season. And they know I made several discoveries there. And so I have a good relationship with them. And they said, look, show us the map. So I showed them maps. They were not aware of the maps. One of the pictures they had seen, but not a map, of a 4th pyramid as well, was also by Norden, but it was like a landscape portrait of the whole Giza Plateau that showed 4 pyramids. And they said, no, we don't think that that's that. We think that he was actually talking about the satellite pyramid. But I mean, I'm a linear perspective geometer, so I know exactly what he meant, because the proportion doesn't match. It's not even close. And then he also gave us a cipher, because he gave us an aerial view of the same pyramid where you could see the small satellite pyramids next to Menkaure and next to the Great Pyramid. And there was a 4th pyramid nonetheless in the same place that Pocock said. So I said, look, I looked at satellite photography. It looks like there might be some mounds out there. Do you mind if I go and look at it? And he's like, no. If you find blocks, let us know. We'll plan to excavate. I went there to the exact spots of the map. And there are literally 2 pyramid-shaped sand mounds with blocks sticking out of them. Like real blocks, and not just any blocks, but large block construction with interlocking mechanisms, right? So it's got basically joint and notch construction where they interlock like Legos. And there's no reason, these are supposed to be natural formations. So I got together with the Scan Pyramid Project, or the SAR team in Italy, and we're scanning those pyramids now underneath. And hopefully we'll start to get the Egyptian government to excavate, because I sent them all the video. I gave it all to them and said, look, here it is. Now you might ask, how could people have missed this? And if you go on my website, if you go on my Instagram page, you'll just scroll down, you'll find these things. But how could someone have missed literally a pyramid-shaped mound in the Giza Plateau Desert? Well, actually, at the time of Napoleon, Menkaure Pyramid was covered in sand. The satellites were completely covered under sand. In fact, at the time of Napoleon, the sand was covering the Sphinx all the way up to its chin. That means there was probably, because the height of the Sphinx is 62 feet, that means that there were 40 feet of sand that was covering the Sphinx alone. Now, once we start to understand that the world is not necessarily what we've been told, because we tend to believe, if you ask, well, how could the Egyptians miss this? How could they have missed two pyramids that irrevocably changed the skyline for, and one of the pyramids would have been 120 feet high. The other pyramid would have been, and they're eroded now. They're definitely eroded, but they're still in the shape of pyramids. And the other pyramid would have been 108 feet high, I believe. And their slope angles match exactly the missing notes from a scale. Now, we don't know this for certain yet, but we're going to get the SAR scan on it. And if we see the same types of structures underneath it and the ground penetrating radar from the satellites, we're going to be looking at those as if they are absolutely pyramids. So how could the Egyptians have missed it? Well, it's hard to find something you're not looking for. When you're told you're here to manage for the three pyramids, you manage the three pyramids. Alan Watts said once in a talk that I was listening to, he said, at the moment that your parents tell you when you see a bird that it's a bird, something irrevocably changes inside your mind. You can no longer see it as anything else. It might have been something else, meaning something else, until the moment it was defined, and then you, with your observation, collapsed a wave function that became the reality that it was a bird, and forevermore you know it as a bird. We lose something when we apply what we're told to everything around us as being absolutely the truth. And we get into this narcissistic cycle or arc when we start believing that there can only be one objective experience. And this is the fundamental fault of science today. The belief that there is one objective experience and it's theirs. I don't know about you guys, but I've never once in my entire life had an objective experience. Every experience I've ever had was entirely subjective. That means that everyone is seeing their own truth based on their own conditioning biases, based on their own knowledge. And without even realizing it, maybe the truth that they see is really just a function of what they believe will benefit them the most. So wait, this means I'm not afraid of people that have darkness. I'm only afraid of people that believe they have no darkness and that their truth is entirely objective. And this is how we end up with genocides. They literally believe, like Hitler did, oh, we have to get rid of a certain subset of the population because it's for the public benefit, for the public good. It's this level of thinking that really represents a narcissistic arc that is the belief that you're the only one that sees the objective reality. But wisdom tells us differently. Socrates said, the more I learn, the less I know. The more I learn, the less I know. And truer words were never spoken. I definitely believe that. And one thing, if there's one thing I've learned throughout my lifetime, when I was 15 years old, I used to tell my parents, come on, mom and dad, these problems in politics, everything, they're easy. Let's bring back capital punishment. Let's kill all the murderers. Let's fix this world. Let's get rid of all the bad guys, all the bad stuff in the world. And then by the time I got to 25 years old, and I remember thinking at that time when I was 15, my parents are pretty stupid. Like, how in the heck, they seem like smart individuals, but why can't they figure out their judgments very well? Then by the time I was 25 years old and I had to like get a job and work and make money and pay taxes and everything, I was like, man, my parents got a lot smarter. And then every year after that, I noticed how my parents became more and more genius. What was expanding was my own consciousness. I started realizing that my objective perspective was not a fact. It was merely a facet of a larger prism of truth. And that I needed to expand my knowledge of perspectives. Maybe the only way to get the truth would be to get the sum of all possible subjective perspectives of that truth. And what if the universe is experiencing itself through our unique eyes of perception, and each one of us becomes a blockchain node validator for our own subjective experiences, so that Source Creator can experience itself through our eyes of uniqueness? And that our goal in life is to remember simply who we are and why we're here, to bring our code, our own unique code, and our own subjectivity and our own individuation to this reality in remembrance. I encourage all of you to remember you are powerful. You have the ability to create the world around you. In fact, you already are with your thoughts and you didn't even realize it. And all of the physics is pointing to this reality right now. So stop with your negative self-narratives. Stop believing that you're a victim, because victimhood only begets more victimhood. And instead start thinking, I can control this reality and I'm going to write my code for the future. The only real limitations are the ones that you persistently and consistently believe in. So break free of this cage of your own mind. You're not in a cage that someone else has created. You're in a cage that you created. The question is, why did you do it? Remember who you are and make a big difference in the world, because you have the ability to do it. Don't just be an automaton in a world of cyber craziness. Be your own individual self and fall in love with that version of you. And when you do, you're going to see your entire world shift dramatically, and you're going to fall in love with it. Thank you very much.